All right. Okay. So we are now going. So this is episode 26, I believe, of the Following Mechanical Turks project. So currently we are writing up results. So we'll take a look at that and where we go from here in terms of composing the uh, manuscript draft. Um, and I guess that's it. Did you
Yeah.
have anything right now, or should we just take a look at the outline?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me pull that up. Here we go. Lemon time. Okay. So you should be looking at this Google Doc, yes?
Yep. Oh yeah.
So here's the outline. So basically, we're more or less kind of following IMRAD's structure. So we've got our introduction, which for us right now is a fair whack of the outline, right? I mean, it's really kind of half of it. Um, I haven't really dug into the intro yet because, as I often encourage my students to tend to write from the middle, right? What you
Yeah.
actually, your results. If you try and start from the introduction, it's not exactly clear where you're going to end up. So it's usually more effective to write from the middle. Right? We know what the methods and we're writing up the results. Then we'll move on to the discussion where we essentially connect the results we find with a larger theoretical framework. We discuss, the import of what's happened. Um, and so probably in terms of the ways we're moving, I now have updated our methods section, which is basically here to here, right? In fact, I probably should parse this out on the outline, but I haven't done it just yet. But the methods has been updated. It's also now posted on the project page. So others should see something very similar to this. I've had a couple of updates that I haven't re-uploaded because the way Manifold works, you have to essentially re-ingest the
Yeah.
text. It's interesting. In fact, this will come up as we move forward because it's not, as far as I can see, in Manifold quite like you're writing web pages, right? You're not exactly, you don't have a WYSIWYG or code interface and you're coding pages. It tends to work through texts, I think, because Manifold is largely a kind of publishing platform rather than like a CMS. So at least as far as I can see, it really kind of mostly wants to deal with finished texts that you can then have people do things like annotate and highlight.
Yeah.
But it seems a little resistant to like there is no real way to just like, okay, well, now I'm going to go in and change this page. And because it doesn't work on sort of a page model. That'll come up for us because of things like embedded diagrams, right? Even breaking things into sections rather than one continual paper, which might be a good idea because this already feels like, I mean, the methods here is a few pages, the results I've written, just the first start of the results and it's already a few pages. So it's like, well, this is probably going to be, longer, as fitting an intermezzo piece, longer than an article, right?
Yeah.
Anywho, so here's the methods and basically what this covers for the methods, because there's kind of a issue here of when we say methods, how much we're going to get into that, because our processes include a lot of separate methods. Now, here's a good example, right? So this is really our results section here. And, when we're dealing with the overview, we're running things like frequencies, right? Just raw frequencies, TF-IDF, some other things, which we'll talk about today. But those are themselves methods, like, well, here are the processes we went through. And it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to talk about those methods as a unit, right? So when we were looking at frequencies, we ran these kind of raw counts through Quantita, and then we got TDF, IDF scores, and then we did these diagrams, and then move on to, and then we categorized them by.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
See what I mean? It doesn't make a lot of sense to do methods, and then go to, okay, now remember back to when we were talking about that, here are the results. It doesn't make any sense.
You mean because at each stage, because we sort of did an iterative thing where we did some methods, got some results, and then did more methods on them.
Yes.
Is that kind of what you're saying? Right. So we didn't just do, here's our method and then results. We kind of went method, result, method, result.
Yes, precisely. So
I wonder, does it make sense? I mean, is that partially, I was just taking some notes, the relationship between methods and operations, right? So there's,
yeah, or processes.
So we kind of did sort of a process, result, and that is the method. Or, I mean, you know what I mean too? There's also a way of thinking about.
Well, so, I mean, it isn't unheard of in IMRAD's structure. It's just that instead of treating these as like train cars, right, where you do all your methods, then you move on to the next, we're dealing with them rather than those kind of horizontal bands. We're dealing with them in vertical columns of methods, results, methods, results. It doesn't go quite as far as methods, results, discussion, method, result, discussion. It really goes methods, results, method, results, which is a variation of IMRAD's structure. And IMRAD is there to be a help, not a hindrance, right? But it's just something to be aware of. So the way that I have it set up, the way that we kind of handle this is the current methods section really is talking, about data collection and processing methods, because those are consistent.
Yeah.
So really, when you look at the methods here, the way it's structured, it starts here by more or less some kind of lit review stuff where it talks about other pieces in rhetoric and broader digital humanities that use similar methods. So a lot of this is just kind of lit review, did your homework, name checky stuff, right? Where these are similar works, some of which helped us in terms of adapt what they're doing. Because there are some here, the Goldstone and Underwood, which uses things like topic modeling and visualization of topic models that are just straight up things that we use. It's like, oh, we use those processes. I think there's another one here, the Miyake, classifying documents using keyness values, where Miyake is doing precisely that. I mean, it's actually a little bit more than that, but taking lit or humanities texts and pointing out how keyness measurements can be useful for categorizing purposes. So some of these are just straight up, these are methods that we're processes that we're pulling. Others are kind of conceptual, right? So like we kind of start with this broader thing of Mueller's network sense, where he's essentially doing text mining in rhetoric. And what's interesting is a lot of rhetorical text mining, a lot of it, and I was going to throw in even my own Kairos work, which, was built on the dissertation.
Yeah.
Text mining. And a lot of text mining in rhetoric is focused on the discipline. I guess it's not that big of a surprise because rhetoric is constantly trying to articulate its own discipline.
Right.
And so
because your map was not the dissertation project, right, is not simply using text mining, really, to not look at rhetorical artifacts, but to look at the discipline itself.
Yes.
Geographically and textually.
And that's what a lot of text mining in rhetoric is. It's not, you'd expect, oh, you're just going to get a lot of text mining of this corpus and then that corpus and that.
Yeah.
It's not really. I mean, you see a lot of that in linguistics, which is adjunct, arguably, to rhetoric, right? I mean, in previous centuries, they'd be identical, or it would be philology, which would be a species of rhetoric.
Right.
But in a more contemporary mold, a lot of what you see is, as you see with Mueller, You also even see it with the Goldstone Underwood, where they're, you'll see from the title here, what can topic models of PMLA?
So it's about that piece, it's about the journal.
Yes. I mean, it's like, so what do we understand about the discipline from the journal? Mueller's doing that in a lot of, and this again kind of builds on his DIS work, which also was about visualizing the discipline.
Yeah.
So a lot of text mining and rhetoric is wrestling with the discipline. So it's like looking at journals, looking at conference titles.
Which I mean, that there's a point to be made that even though we're not doing that, I think that they're probably doing it for the same reason that we're doing the way we're doing is we're trying to get a sense of, right, in order to a certain extent to do that kind of text mining for disciplinarity is to map where that discipline, what its shape is.
Yes.
So in that sense, it is similar to what we're doing with Mechanical Turks with respect to how is it drawing boundaries around or between the human and the non-human. So in that sense, it's an analogous procedure.
Yeah.
A lot of that disciplinary work using text mining is to figure out sort of what's the shape of this thing we're in.
And what separates it? Because when you have a discipline, you have to distinguish it from other disciplines.
Right. What makes this
large not, what makes it not, well, as we just said, why is this not linguistics?
Right.
Anywho, so there's that. Then also like the Rodolfo, have you seen or read the Rodolfo Hart Davidson Rhetoric in the Digital Humanities?
Not the whole book, but yeah, I've got it. And I read a chapter here and there as needed.
So I was plucking out, I pointed to all of them because, part of this grounding is just, well, hey, these are techniques that are used in the discipline for different reasons.
Yeah.
But I pointed to Nathan Johnson's modeling rhetorical disciplinarity mapping in the digital network, even though it's like a lot of these are kind of potentially more predicated on visualization, which our work is too, really. But at least it references text mining and talks specifically about text mining. Anywho, so there's a lot of this kind of lit reviewy kind of stuff here at the beginning of the methods. It then moves on to, literally the processes we went through to collect the A sample. Because again, now we're really just talking about the A sample.
Yeah.
The B sample, if we even, do and are allowed to use that, it doesn't appear here because really we're looking at hit, titles, and descriptions. And compensation. That's really what we're looking at.
Yeah.
In part because, as we've talked about before, the B sample really gets at Turker sentiment, right? That's what the B sample collects. And this product is not really so much about Turker sentiment. It's more systemic. It's more about what's on MTurk itself. What is the language of the hits, right?
Yeah.
So this section, the method section, kind of tries to articulate that. And as we'll see here in a bit, it kind of ends with that. So this section here is, how we collected it. We went to worker@mturk.com, how we collected, the samples there in terms of, we sorted it by number of available hits and used this cleaning script and that thing. This next section here talks about doing it longitudinally over a certain amount of months, which gave us over 23,000 individual items, right? Each with these 12 features. Although really we only use a handful of those, but they're there, they're in the data. Right. It then talks about how we processed it using R and sort of the main packages we used. Quantita is by far the one we use the most here. And kind of some adjunct packages like read text. Tidy text makes an appearance, particularly when dealing with n-gram diagramming. That's really where it shows up. But even then, we're mostly processing things with Quantita.
Okay.
And then the LDA viz package, which we've seen that. That's the one that you may remember gives us that online interface of a topic model. You remember this.
Yeah, and you could make adjustments on the fly.
Precisely.
not adjustments, but you could, pull out particular things.
Yeah, I mean, you could make small tweaks to it in terms of like highlighting things. It's true, you can't change parameters, but you could set things. Um, there are those sliders available to allow you to do certain modifications. Um, and then this kind of explains what we just talked about. Because we perform multiple operations on the data at different grain sizes, it's more effective to address results as separate vertical groups of processes and findings, rather than treating these elements as horizontal aggregates, right? And the following results section of this article follows this schema. So instead of treating this as all of the methods and now all of the results, because that wouldn't make, it just wouldn't be readable. It treats this as the findings are processes, the results are findings process, processes, findings, processes, findings, processes, findings. And it is in fact 3 groups. Excuse me. And this kind of points out why. One thing about the methods section is it does in a couple of places. I didn't want it to just recur and recur, but it points out this is exploratory rather than determinative, right?
Yeah, and that's been our sort of methods from the get-go.
Right. Does it? No, it doesn't do that here, does it? No, because I think that comes. I believe that comes at the end of the intro, doesn't it? Yeah. There's this bit from McLuhan. I don't explain, I explore, right? And I saw that really as coming at the end of the introduction, moving into the methods rather than something in the methods itself. But I think that should be in there in part because it is a kind of useful framing of what we're doing and why, the methods section isn't, okay, we went through this precise single operation and use these parameters because we were answering this precise question, when in fact our questions are kind of open-ended, and why that isn't a hedge, right? I mean, you can see those kind of open-ended questions as in need of revision. It's like, well, you need to actually answer a more crisp question here. But I think what we're doing with this piece is saying, no, the questions are slightly broader than that, but here's why that isn't just a weakness. It's not just that we haven't actually pushed forward, it's that we're intending to do some exploratory work rather than some determinative, here's the answer to this more precise question. Anywho, so that's that. And then this ends, this last part of the methods is sort of a qualification, and it looks forward to ultimately what will come later in the piece, probably in the conclusion, that kind of the main thing that we discussed as a limitation of the data collection processes, right? And as was, kind of more brought to our attention, that the method of any method of data collection is thoroughly rhetorical. You have to make all these choices, and we keep bumping up against these. Even things like, do we treat them as sort of a flat list of 23,000 different posts, or do we weight each post by its number of available hits, which scales from 1 to, it actually goes up. One of them is, I believe, hundreds of thousands.
Right.
The mode is actually, and this does mention here somewhere, the mode is 1. Of course, it goes by modeling. Oh, maybe that's actually in the results. The mode is 1, so most of them are 1 available hit, but some of them jump up into the thousands, the tens of thousands, 1, I believe, in the hundreds of thousands. So anywho, there's that aspect, but then there's also the aspect of the collection process we're using of going to the online interface, the mTurk interface, right, the worker interface, and then collecting jobs longitudinally. That could have a kind of bias. Well, it definitely does have a kind of bias that may be things like collect atypical jobs, because active Turkers may not be going through that process, right? They may be going, or they may be getting access to hits through third parties, through plugins.
Right.
They may also, the jobs they do may not last very long, right? Those jobs may get immediately snapped up by Turkers. So by going through the process we're going through, we may be getting atypical jobs that are, as I
Yeah.
think it says here, ones that are ambiguously written or badly compensated or unfeasible or issued by, right? So there may be the ones we're getting may be atypical jobs. But as this talks about, there's kind of two ways to view this. From this perspective, many hits this study collected are, unlike those active Turkers, complete. There's a legitimate point, but it's important to clarify that this study intentionally adopts a materialist view of MTurk as a complex system rather than a humanistic orientation that aligns with Turkers' experiences, right? So what we're doing is not going through how does a Turker actually see this. It's really not our goal. Our goal is what is on the platform. And so from that perspective, all these quote unquote badly written jobs are a significant fraction of what is on the platform.
Right. Yeah.
So it's you're making a choice here. Is your choice, well, that's not how Turkers do it. Okay. But what we're looking at is what's on the platform. And what's on the platform is honestly a lot of junk.
Yeah.
But we want that junk because that's the platform, right? So a person could say, and a person did say, those are junk jobs, but it's like, yeah, that's what we want. We want to see what's on the platform.
If it turns out that what's on the platform are junk jobs, then that's what, if it may be that what defines Mechanical Turks, which is of interest to us, is at any given moment, it's largely full of poorly articulated junk jobs that no one wants.
At least a portion of it. You could say, but your processes aren't actually tapping in a meaningful way to the kind of active or the jobs that active Turkers do. Yeah. And so what this section does is point out, right? A subsequent study from this research project will more explicitly interrogate Turkers' engagement with hits, right? The second product is the one that is more in line with Turkers' engagement with the platform, right? I mean, it's explicitly about that. It's why we have to go through IRB for the second product. Yeah. So we're going to be talking to, or at least posting, jobs that are asking Turkers about these precise things, right?
Yeah. And what we may discover is that those are, in terms of the kind of results we get. I mean, again, this is the sort of meta aspect of what we're doing, which is, the ways in which we're approaching this using coding and that there's, anyway, long story short, it may be that then the second piece that the platform looks radically different.
Yes.
Which will be part of what we're interested in. The fact that there's actually multiple versions of this, and that depends on how it's getting practiced, how it's getting taken up, which is in part what we're interested in, right? The kind of non-Platonic idea of what Turk is. It's like there's no pure form of Mechanical Turks. It depends on how one engages it and interacts with it.
And potentially the default is to align with the human Turkers, right? To align with, well, this is how they use it, and that's why this is important. But a materialist orientation is humans are just a part of this, right?
Yeah.
And we're more interested in the system itself, of which humans exercise some level of managerial control. But, this isn't a humanistic orientation. Anywho, I don't think that's a hard sell to the main audience for this, right?
Yeah.
I don't think we have to, get too much into, because probably the main audience for this will be rhetoricians, probably who are sympathetic to materialist orientations, I would suspect. So I don't think we really have to do a lot of work selling why this is a valuable approach. But this section here acknowledges because I think we need to here in the methods, hey, there are definite limitations to this, as there are limitations to every choice of method, right? Every choice of method is interested, is subjective, is biased inherently. It's, I think, dubious that anything unbiased exists. Show me one at any point in history, human or non, and I'll agree with you, but I've never seen one. It's a rare animal. Anywho, so that's what the methods does, is really it sets up data collection. It does this work of sort of lit review, why what we're doing is appropriate, tersely. It walks through here's how we actually collected the stuff, and it gives kind of this acknowledgement of limitation and looks toward the conclusion and says, we know this is a potential, if limitation is too pejorative, a consequence or an implication of the choices we have made is this. We're aware of that, and the next product will attempt to address that. Because really, our conclusion probably should be fairly brief, I would think, because basically it's just going to kind of recap what we did and where we're going next. And for us, that's a pretty clear roadmap. Here's where we're going next. We kind of know that.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the gist of this. Do you have any questions?
No, I've just been taking note. I've as I mentioned earlier, using this material to kind of jumpstart my own contributions to this. So I've been taking some notes. I'm using this inventionally. So.
Well, and I've just been slugging away in quarantine. So it's sometimes sort of tough to, I have no perspective other than my own at this point, whatever that means. But I did post this here, and I started to kind of categorize our text. So we've got meta documents like the overview and the credits. Now I'm starting to post drafts, right? Because things like this methods section, eventually, I folded in the comments we had to the best of my ability. And re-uploaded now this version. And so this will be, the manuscript version, you know what I mean? Because of the process we're going through. So that'll get comments from reviewers of, both kind of the kinds we have been getting and presumably assigned. I don't exactly know how Intermezzo is going to handle that, but whatever.
Yeah, I think that'll be something to discuss too, is how is this something that we have intermezzo, or is this actually something that then we send someplace else even?
No, I'm pretty sure it's intermezzo.
Yeah. No,
And but I think we should consult with them. Here we have a manuscript.
Yeah.
Do you want to assign, and it's accessible here online, and do you want to assign people, or do we put a call through other organs for outside reviewer? How should we handle this? But I'm pretty sure the process will be, hey, we've got a finished draft here.
Yeah.
Because, there's kind of two things here. There's the project, which is its own animal, but then there are products that spin out of that. And the products, as I see them, will be not unlike the other Intermezzo products, let's say. Not unlike online scholarship in rhetoric and composition.
Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, there's that. So that handles pretty much this right here. In fact, so let me just change. One of the beauties of this is we can do this on the fly. Hit page up. I always do that. So there's the method section, and I'm using, if you're not looking at the outline here, I am using, I'm an outliner. and I am using the outline. So this isn't just sort of like a notes page where things got dumped and, whatever. I'm actually using this outline and updating it as I go. So this, I think, gives us kind of a decent look at the sections, right?
Yeah.
So here's results, and really parse this. And I can actually remove that because it does indeed make sense to put these. This is the answer. Results. This actually is.
Yeah, I revisited that first note I reread yesterday. That David Auteur piece on Polanyi's paradox as a way to
Polanyi. We got to figure out how to pronounce that. Well, I guess we don't have to, but
Polanyi. Yeah, that sounds right. Because I just anyway, just while we're here brainstorming out loud, that I thought, particularly because we had that related discussion about how COVID and the quarantine has sort of reorganized labor in some interesting ways. And what I found going back through that Polanyi is thinking about the possible play on the ways in which we're thinking now about sort of what's essential and non-essential, which is sort of interesting in terms of what we're in part exploring is the kind of essence of the human as it gets articulated through this system, right? So the idea of COVID and mechanical Turks sort of reorganizing labor in terms of essential or non-essential is sort of what's of the essence about this kind of labor and how they both sort of parse it differently. Because in many ways, if I was David Auteur who had authored this Polanyi's paradox piece, that the ways in which COVID has re-essentialized labor maps pretty well onto that paradox.
Mm-hmm.
Right, this sort of high, I forget how the different ways, but essentially the kind of highly trained medical professionals, but then also the certain kind of mechanical labor of stocking, right?
Social clerks, right? People
that also can't be so easily replaced or automated.
Or their crucial aspect.
You still need, right, that an Amazon fulfillment center is largely operationalized by barcode scan, right? It's very automated, except the human laborers that essentially move things from shelves to shelves, right? Mm-hmm. That's much harder to replace. And so in the context of COVID, right, the doctor and the nurse practitioner and the stocker and the person at the fulfillment center become equally essential, mm-hmm. because they possess some qualities that are hard to replicate or automate or.
Yeah. Well, or they sometimes that's the last mile, right, where a lot of it can be automated until you get to the very last part where it meets the consumer or whatever, right? So the last mile of the grocery chain is a stocker or a cashier, right? The last mile of internet service is someone who has to go out into rural areas and install, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, the thing of it is, the point of our work, and it's something we'll grapple with, is not, I don't think, well, see, Polanyi's paradox is correct, right? I mean,
I
always kind of hedge at work that end with, and therefore, this pre-existing theoretical work is indeed true. So let me add my evidence to the pile.
Right.
Or the other direction. Therefore, this pre-existing framework shows us this new example, right? I mean, it's kind of the binarity of either what I'm seeing is indeed in keeping with this, or this thing reveals to us this. It's sort of like, yeah, but we have a greater point, I would assume, that the
Oh
theoretical
yeah, yeah,
work allows us to see. The question is, what will our larger thing be, right? I'm not sure we necessarily know that just yet.
yeah,
But I mean, something we'll engage is, what theoretical framework will help us, yeah, as I wrote here, understand the implications of our findings, right? So here's the things we found. What does Polanyi's paradox, for example, let us know about
yeah,
Turk, about, the system, about culture based on our findings, so the theoretical is operational,
yeah,
you know, or, it's perfectly legitimate to use this to build new theory, right? If that is our goal, um, we are building new theory. That's woof. That's what we are doing here.
yeah,
But that will be the work of the discussion section, right? Which in IMRAD's structure is, so you have your findings now. What do those findings mean, right? Um, Anywho, so we've got Polanyi's as potentially a way there. We've talked about some others, right? Like heteromation. We
yeah,
talked about some other things from Casey, and I think maybe Scott, maybe Jim talked
yeah.
about a few other things.
And I think going back to the Kang as well is useful. That essentially kind of what he traces is that whatever is taken to be uniquely human is always in accordance with what has been able to be automated or not. So there's always this kind of juxtaposition between how a certain kind of human autonomy is always being juxtaposed relative to a certain kind of automaton or automation.
Yeah.
So
Mm-hmm.
that sort of shifts. So in that sense, right, using that theoretical framework, we can see how Mechanical Turks, which is trying to accomplish some set of tasks, redefines the human in accordance with what it has so far been unable to
Yeah.
automate.
I mean, that's something we potentially can forward is here's how this is different now, right?
Yeah,
Here's how it's drawing lines differently now, or whatever. So I think probably the way we'll proceed is this. We've got, a draft of the methods section. I'm now writing up the results I've gotten here. Um, the good news, I think, is the results here um, are they're ready to go in terms of the stuff is basically done. And I know we're no longer at the stage of, well, hey, maybe this would be of interest, maybe that. It's like I know what I'm doing. So I've written up. Oh yeah, here they are. I've started to write up the results, and yeah, and this sketches the rest of them. We don't have to go into this too much, but like it talks about what frequency and TDIF show us, and those are kind of things like raw frequencies and TF-IDF surface things like the main tasks, the main hits that are at play in the corpus, right? And I'm writing up, it's not so much, as you mentioned, the verbs of task, right? It's not identify that is the differentiator. It's things like areas of competence, right? Identify if this is a luxury brand. That's something really, I think it's fair to say, only a human can do. Identify, why this handbag is fancy or
right.
whatever. It's these areas. And the other main one I pointed out, because it surfaces in the frequency and TF-IDF, is trauma, right? Humans are sophisticated sensors of trauma in a way that non-humans aren't. They can't talk about reliving past experiences with cancer. They can't
Yeah.
talk about PTSD because I was a veteran. So that's in this first part, what those even those raw counts show are those kinds of things, and things like the prevalence of bot jobs and related things, right? So bot jobs is one thing. Something that's similar but not the same are things that are composed through automation. So there's a whole run of jobs that are sequential and that their descriptions are nearly identical, but the only thing really that switches is the brand name. So it has, same text about Coke, about AMC, about Ford, right? But the descriptions are essentially identical and the requesters are different. So what's interesting there is probably that was written through, it was composed at least partially through automation, right? A human didn't type those up. And the fact that they come from different requesters, even though they're the same thing sequentially, so at the same time, essentially, that suggests what's going on there is probably they were skirting a system that would catch precisely what they're doing, right? They're gaming the system in a
Right.
particular way in order to write these. So that's another sort of collaboration between automation and human beings. And then you've also got things like machine learning training, right? So picking out the boundaries, because boundaries
Yeah.
is a term that pops up. So probably you're training a machine, you're doing CAPTCHA work, probably, right? So there's kind of a range of collaboration between humans and non-humans there, right? That you can see in even just these sort of raw frequency sort of things. So that's what I've written up so far.
The other one that just jumps out at me too, I just was making a note on this in terms of what you lost. Oh, that one of the hits that I was also interested in is essentially people they're given words to put into Google search autofill and then report on what the results of that are, which also kind of strikes me as this kind of interesting sort of almost like last mile job, which is the human in that. The human is whatever can make sense of and utilize the results of the autofill, right? That the last step of the autofill operation is, well, Google can generate these autofill into the search results, but you need that last sensor at the end, which is a human, to make sense of that autofill. Just a kind of analogous operation, maybe.
Yeah. So the question would be, does that emerge in these counts? And in some ways it does. I'll make a note because, the way that this is broken is, what pops out when you look at the frequency stuff? What pops out when you look at TF, IDF, or doc frequency, right? Because then there's sort of linkage between, okay, well, this is what is frequent, and here's potentially how that is working. Autofill, I don't think is a super common term, but
I don't think that wasn't the term that was showing up. It was I forget what it was, but I need to dig back into it. But there was a series of hits that were built around like, not experimenting with autofill, but running some operations on it.
Well, so the question will be where to slot that. I mean, one thing that does come up, and this is mentioned in the results, are those kinds of data collection and transcribing and entering data. Because that is something that pops up, are, like the ISIN codes, that does pop up. I think in TF IDF,
Yeah, and it was actually it was in the bottom 20 group in the weighted I'm looking at the bar graph, the line graphs now. But yeah, it was autofill result. I'm looking at the bigrams. Google and into Google, string into, but basically it was copy a string into Google and then record the autofill results.
So see, this will be the question. And what you might do is on this page, which is preliminary data findings, the question is, where would this information go, right? Because like in the outline, this stuff is all driven by the overarching stuff. So it does frequency, it does TF-IDF, and then we'll talk about these other diagram stuff. Then we move on to the compensation tiers. And, you know, it kind of transitions. This is looking at the data as a whole, right? The second grouping is looking at it categorized by compensation tiers. And we do, of course, some of the same things. Frequency, TF-IDF, mainly keyness, because that's going to be specific to categorization.
Yeah.
It's kind of the characteristic thing of categorizing. This actually won't be here. And then we move on to word level comparison. So some of this is we were finding words that might be interesting. You can almost think of this as moving in grain size, right? This first thing is the data as a whole. The second thing is the data in categories. The last thing is individual words, right? So you can even think of this as a kind of triangle or funnel or whatever. So the question will be, where would your observation fit, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's really the thing, is we want to include it. It's just, does it pop up when you're looking at frequencies? Is it something that pops up when you're looking at compensation tiers, right? But anywho, that's how this will go. As I said, right now I've basically written up these things here in overview. I've started with these diagrams, and let me show you this really quickly. So this goes from, because when you're looking at frequency and TF-IDF and even doc frequency, you're looking at individual features, unigrams, bigrams, trigrams. It's still the features themselves in isolation, right? These diagrams, look at them in relief to each other. So FCM is a frequency co-occurrence matrix that basically looks at documents. Well, you can tell it to do whatever you want, but the way we're doing it is it looks at documents, which in our case is basically hit titles and hit descriptions. Those we put together basically. So that's a document, right? So the FCM looks at words that frequently co-occur within documents, right? So if these two terms appear in the same document a whole lot, then their score goes up. Basically, that's the gist of it. So it lets you see words that are together a lot within documents, right? This isn't too far from things like word embeddings, which do generally a similar thing, although instead of going by document, they go by position. You take a word and then you look at the word next to it and the word next to it and the word next to it out to a particular window on both sides, essentially. And FCMs can do that as well anyway. Making an FCM is a step along the way toward building word embeddings. But anywho, so you can make diagrams out of FCMs. Basically what I did was, you can't do the full FCM because it would just be a big ball of spaghetti because you're talking about every feature. So what you do is you take the highest scoring ones, basically. Like I think I took the top 50. And you can plot them out. They look basically like, so like this is the unweighted FCM, right? This is basically the top terms in terms of co-occurrence. So these things that the links between them are co-occurrence, right? So you can see certain things even in this, and you can filter how many or how few you want, because, this could look a little confusing unless, like you and I've seen this data so much, I can look at these and say, I know what's going on here. I know what's going on here.
Right.
Beaten over the head with these. But here, I mean, you can see things like, principles, survey, study. Oh, and I also destemmed these, which again is a choice, because in looking at co-occurrence, I was kind of more interested in teasing out, there's value, I think, particularly because I'm looking at a thinner slice, it's just the top ones, and the difference between the word study and studies. Because if you stem those, it'll look at co-occurrence with those stems.
Yeah.
But here, I'm kind of more interested, because it's a zoom in. So I thought it would be useful to preserve their unstemmed forms, because then you can see, oh, okay, study links to these, but studies links to these.
Right? Yeah, those aren't. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
So anywho, you can stem these, and I did some preliminary stuff, and it's not that different, and I thought it was valuable to leave them unstemmed.
Yeah.
But you can see things like survey, complete, study, minutes, and then things that also branch off, right? Questionnaire, well-being is a big hook, and that taps to things like coping and mental health, right? Over here, this branch that's loosely joined to this, you can see this is precisely the sort of data entry stuff you're talking about, because it's centered around ISIN, which are stock codes, which you also see here, stock code, Google. They basically want you to Google for stock codes. Not quite the same as autocomplete, right? Because that arguably has more of a human element to make sense of the autocomplete. This sort of like, the other data entry jobs where it was, look up this address for a real estate company. Or remember all the political stuff?
Oh, yeah, it was.
A lot of which was like, look up the party that this person belonged to or whatever,
Right, it was some kind of aggregate, yeah.
So it's kind of like straight up data entry, right? Versus what you're talking about is a little bit more data synthesis, where it's, do the autocomplete, but then if your job as the Turker is to make sense of that, what's the good one in these
well, what's interesting is going back and then I checked my notes, it's actually not reporting, it's almost like it's testing. It's unclear what the task is getting at, because it gives you the chunk of words to put in, and then it wants to know what Google then autofills it with. So it's kind of,
it may just be sort of data collection-y. I mean, you do have to do it.
Yeah.
But it's not too far from this kind of thing then.
No. Oh, yeah. Makes sense.
Anyway, so you can kind of see this, and these are the unweighted ones. This over here, these are.
Real quick for a second, it's now showing the outline is what I'm seeing up on the screen.
Oh, yeah. Let me switch over here. Sorry. It's because I shared the application window rather than my screen.
Monster.
Sorry, there you go.
There we go.
So this is a frequency co-occurrence matrix diagram using Quantita, which is a great package. And you can see sort of the nexus here and the offshoots here, right? What we were just talking about. This over here, this is because these are Unicode characters. Yeah, so this is the unweighted one, which means, taking each hit just sort of as a flat list. If you weight them, it's interesting because you'd think, why wouldn't the weighted one have a lot more stuff? And in a way it doesn't, because, well, partially it's because of the way the diagram is chart is presented, but also keep in mind when you weight them, the jobs that have many more available hits,
yeah,
they separate from the pack.
Yeah.
So you get this, in a sense, kind of more beautiful structure, because when you're talking the top 50, you're just getting ones that have a load of available hits.
Yeah. That is really, I mean, the just visually, the difference between the weighted and the unweighted one is really.
I know, but that's why we do this.
Amen.
What's interesting is things like markets research and branding start to emerge
Yeah.
in the weighted ones. Some light video clip stuff, which is transcription, description, that kind of stuff.
Now, what I don't know if you mentioned is what is this the whole? Is this is compensation showing up here at all, or is this just the whole thing?
This is the whole corpus.
Okay, okay, that's what I thought. Okay,
Yeah, this isn't moving into categorization. Now you can do this stuff with the categories, but and see that's actually well, I'd have to on the outline. Um, it says, should I be doing these kinds of diagrams for each compensation tier? The problem is you get so many diagrams because you're talking about 30 diagrams there. Its utility would be limited, I suspect, because you get so many. It's like, what can I actually make of this? We've already got the keenness measurements and their corresponding diagrams.
yeah.
I think when we turn to categories, hi, honey.
Charlie.
What you looking for, baby? I think they're in my office, plugged into your computer. We get so many of them, the utility is limited. But anywho, yeah. So this is we'll get at that stuff, but I think we'll get at it through keenness measurements. I don't think we need to do this.
This is really interesting. I mean, it's yeah. I mean, because you have the brand. I mean, that's and then input, and then this down here, right? That's kind of all of that stuff we were seeing that was
shopping receipts, yeah,
and distinct from these other two, right? That this over here, I'm actually using my mouse as if you can see where my cursor is at, but the one that's got market, survey, attempt, research, right? That's a certain kind of. I mean, you can see that.
Yep.
In other words, what I'm trying to say is that what I'm seeing here is in part. Not verifying is not the word I want to use, but this does map onto how I had been understanding the corpus.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of this breakdown is like this bottom right-hand corner is this sort of ideally we'd want a machine could just read these receipt. I mean, a lot of these I think are those hits where it's where the sense I'm getting is that some of these receipt images aren't very good images. And so something like OCR, you can't run them on them, right? Because they've got hand written annotations on them.
Either you're training OCR or you're shoring up the gaps in OCR.
Right.
Or both.
Yeah. And then this brand one is also a certain kind of identifying, right? But you also see words like relevant, which seems to be, and identify, which seems to be somewhat distinct from transcribe and extract. And a word like values, I mean, that might not be value as in a value someone has. That might also be, a number, right? Inputting a value of something. Yeah, and then this big cluster to the left, yeah, really is really interesting.
Yeah, and so what's interesting is, well, one thing that's interesting is if you look at the unweighted and the weighted, right? What's primary in the unweighted here? Mental health, coping.
Yeah.
Veterans, right? When you weight them, market research, brands, extracting shopping receipts, right?
Yeah.
I mean, to an extent, it's like, because, you look at this so much, it's like, well, yeah, that's what it's about. And it's like, well, yeah, that's what it's about. Those impressions you have of the corpus are because we've looked at the corpus a whole lot, so part of me is sometimes when I see this, it's like, well, I'm seeing what I know is there. And it's like, well, yeah, I mean, that's what this is supposed to do.
Yeah. But this is really helping me also just to really understand the significance of whether you weight them or not.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because
I mean,
also because we've all the weighted, unweighted we've been doing have been within the compensation levels.
Well, I mean, the counts are weighted. If you look at the, it's called sample A. Let me see, what is it called?
Yeah.
A sample collected processed that has, frequency, dog frequency, TF-IDF. It has unigrams, bigrams, trigrams, unweighted, weighted. So there's 6, right? We do the weighting and non-weighting at really every level or whatever. But yeah, you get
I think
very.
what I was saying is that visually, I guess I've been seeing the difference between weighted and unweighted in the bar graph charts we have.
Yeah.
But seeing it for the whole
Yeah.
thing is, I mean, even again, right? This is in part the data visualization package, but it just looks like, I mean, given that our like original analogy was kind of, using sonar to determine the shape of something, right? You really just get a different mechanical Turks just as a shape looks different from weighted to unweighted.
Well, and see why I think it's valuable to do this stuff here is because then when we move to compensation tiers, we can plug them into this discussion.
Yeah.
Right. Say do the compensation tiers, for example, follow this, where mental health jobs are high compensated and data entry here is low compensated. Do they follow that schema? And our answers more or less are no, not exactly.
Yeah, if we were to put, right, if we were to lay over, would all the high compensation jobs be up in this top left-hand corner, the mid compensation job be over in the top right, and the low right? I mean, that would be a way in which you would imagine a certain way. If we laid one over the other, would there be any correspondence between compensation levels and the sort of 3 areas that we're seeing?
But from our preliminary results, which I have, did I post those? I don't think I posted those. But last episode, we looked at the preliminary results. Gosh, I must have shared those. Let me do. So these, do you remember this when it was our last episode?
Yeah.
I went through, yes, the findings about what's in the tiers, basically.
Yeah.
So they're broken into the tiers, and then it goes into keenness and TF-IDF, both, or I should say all, unigrams, expanded or unexpanded, bigrams, blah, blah, blah. So what's actually in those tiers, and see why these diagrams we're looking at are useful is precisely this. It's like, well, in looking at this, does it map to that? And I think our answer is not really. And so it allows us to have a more sophisticated discussion about this, right?
Yeah.
These tiers of compensation do not match the breakdown of the corpus as a whole in kind of a humanist job oriented way. Well, data entry gets you this, but surveys about your mental health gets you that. It doesn't really break that way. In kind of a Polanyi-esque way, it's like, well, sometimes reliving your worst memory is high compensated, but not always.
Right.
It kind of, it's a little more fine grained than just drawing circles around the diagrams and saying, oh, okay, well, that's that kind of class, that kind. When you look at it in terms of compensation, it's like, well, no, sometimes they interplay with each other, right? So that's why I think it's valuable to do this kind of, because part of me was like, why bother with this overview stuff at all? Let's just start with the compensation tiers, right? Do you remember we had kind of a discussion about it?
I was just recalling that, yeah, is we're, thinking about various ways in and where to start.
But now I'm like, I think there's value to this, getting your arms around the corpus as a whole, because then when you have the compensation tier discussion, you can say it doesn't match.
Well, I remember, that was part of our discussion that once we pick compensation as a way in, right, there's no way back out of that to a certain extent. But now I think with this sort of overarching view, it at least gives us some like a foil for it, or it gives us a way of recognizing that even as we go into the compensation, it gives us another, I'm not saying this, but maybe it's just a reminder that organizing it or sensing it based on compensation is a decision that we made, and that having the larger map of the whole, like getting our arms around it, as you described, sort of checks that, right? It keeps you
Yeah.
honest as you pursue one particular way of arranging it.
Well, and it also speaks to the intro here. So if in our introduction, it's why you don't write the introduction first. If in our introduction, we were largely talking about labor and compensation issues, right? Then I would say, yeah, when you get to your results, why bother with this stuff at all? Just start here, right?
Right.
I mean, as an editor, as a journal editor, I would say if your intro is labor and compensation,
Just
and
do
so
that.
what's that?
Just do that all the way through. You don't need all
Yeah.
this other stuff.
Cut this overview stuff out and just get to the meat of it, which is, so we looked at labor and compensation in MTurk. The best way to do that probably is break those into compensation tiers. How you parse that is of course subjective, but since you have the compensation data, break it that way. But I'm not sure that's what we're doing, right? I mean, in our intro, I'm not sure that's how we're setting things up. Now, if it so happens that our intro could still do that, then I think we just cut this section.
Right.
And information into this. But I mean, at this stage, this is still valuable, right? And it may be valuable to keep. It may be valuable just to do the process, depending on how things get set up. So, I mean, all of this is to say, I think our steps are to write up the results, write up the discussion, and then once we've done that, then you know the intro.
Yeah.
You know what you have to set up. If our discussion focuses on stuff like, labor issues, then that's what we set up in the intro. Probably we cut out this in the findings, in the results. But if it focuses on other stuff, then maybe this stays and we write up our introduction along those lines, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's the way we're going to go. Is we've got the methods. I'm writing up the results. There are some caveats we'll look at. We'll do the discussion, and from there, you can either do the conclusion, which I think will be brief. I mean, I think that literally would take a day or two to fire that off, because at that point, you're going to know, your recap here, and we already at this point know where we're going from here, probably.
Yeah.
Then, the intro will come from the discussion. I mean, I think, the results, I can work my way through the results. You can add the results also. The discussion will be kind of the theoretical thing where we really have to figure out, what does this mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that'll set up the intro we need to write.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Right now, the intro, I mean, right now the bloody intro goes back to Plato. So
yeah.
Which, may or may not, which, for this audience can probably be a sentence, right? Where Plato's not into prostheticism. He's not into writing because it weakens essential humanity.
Yep.
We're done with it.
Yeah, move on. Yeah.
We don't have to prove that. It's accepted in our discourse community.
Yeah. I'm wondering if, and again, we're not writing it yet, but I'm wondering if some of that Kang material might be useful, that the introduction can also be a way that we not sneak in, but we build in some of that, at least history stuff.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, here,
Kang, yeah, that's right.
You'll notice, I mean, because the intro is fairly right now expansive. So there are kind of these things that it's like, do we want to look at this? Because Kang, if I remember correctly, is largely kind of historical, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's sort of like it's history work.
Yeah.
Which we can do. I mean, we can set up. Here's what Kang says about this heretofore. And what he doesn't do is move into the computer, right?
Right.
He stops before he gets to the computer. And in fact, that's what he talked to us about. He's like, the next volume would be that point forward. And so we can extend. I mean, if that's what we want to do, we can do that, is say, he sets the groundwork up to this point.
It does. It does. It's both part of, the doing our homework, right? That this is, that if we're dealing at this notion of artificial intelligence, right? If we're going to sort of pay homage to the mechanical Turk aspect of this, but I think it also helps set up a kind of it also helps sort of do more with the kind of platonic thing we're using as a foil,
Mm-hmm.
which is that this helps us, that what we get from Kang is a history of the mechanical Turk, and why that decision to call it that is a way in for us. But it's also a way of tracing the kind of cultural technique we're also getting at, which is that the cultural technique that results in the concept of the human is always this back and forth between what's possible through automation and what isn't.
Mm.
And that's kind of, I think, at least how I'm starting to understand the kind of mechanical Turk. These hits are basically always are both identifying that where you need the human and what you need the human to do, but also, given how much of these hits also appear to be machine learning tasks, it's that the mechanical Turk is both something we can use to sense where those distinctions might be, but it's also a system that's designed to keep pushing those distinctions.
Yeah. Well, and if that's the way we end up, I mean, if this is more or less kind of a historical piece, i.e., extending, here's, this goes to here. When we look at something like M Turk, it adds on to this lineage.
Yeah.
Then yeah, I mean, we can set that up. It doesn't forbid us from using something like Poliani, or even, how contemporary events.
Yeah. No, and I think we would need and we also don't want to make the introduction just history, because the goal of our project isn't to simply add on to what Hang has done, because we're also speaking to a particular rhetorical audience.
Right.
So I don't think the introduction would be historical, but the introduction, one of the introductory moves would be a telling of this history. But I think the telling of that history might then, and again, of course, now I'm making the mistake of writing the introduction, right? We'd add the history, and that history gets us to this particular moment, which we can then describe this moment. But that history also can be understood by using something like Poliani's paradox, because that's in part what Kang is working, right? He's also providing a kind of a historical background of that paradox.
Right. Yeah.
But I think what's useful about Kang is that not just not just sort of doing our homework, but also what his history indicates is it performs how this line keeps shifting relative to the technological capacities of that moment.
Yeah. Well, and this might, some of the comments on our drafts, I think astutely, were asking questions like, what's the stakes in what you're doing, right? The question of why this matters, or why, right? And I was like, that's always a great question, and that might help answer that. What are the stakes here? Of why does it matter how we're parsing these things? One thing also we'll need to think about is, to what degree is this conversation for this paper versus what we're seeing as the third paper, right?
Yeah.
The sort of larger cultural technique stuff. And, to an extent, sorry.
Given my normal mode of scholarly production, clearly I keep bleeding into that third page. The risk for me is always jumping ahead to that third piece.
Well, and, which is good. The risk potentially that third piece becomes an amorphous blob.
Right.
It's like, well, let's just pack that in there too.
Which is also my want.
What's that?
Which is also my amorphous blob's kind of my brand.
Yeah, me too. I mean, that's common. Well, and it's why I'm so keen on doing things like writing these outlines, because I know my tendencies are to run far afield. As someone who I submitted a chapter draft to, that you and Paul said, great, this needs to be a third of what you wrote. Right? Yeah,
Yeah.
it really does. But yeah, so, I mean, that's why I'm so, strict on, well, let's stick to this so that, everything doesn't grow into an amorphous blob. But I mean, I think that's one thing we can do is figure out, all right, so what does this, kind of, text mining work? What piece does that show? And then that can set, particularly if that third piece, if its animating thing is cultural techniques,
Yeah.
then potentially the Kang could manifest mostly here. And then that later piece could build from this, right? I mean, like overtures to this previous work and then build from that, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, and that even makes sense in terms of the kind of what also cultural technique is, not theoretically, but also its own method is in part historical, right? So people that do things like media archaeology are interested in cultural techniques. That to really understand something as a cultural technique, you have to do something historical, right? You have to see from where that is emerging. So I think if we started with just a kind of historical overview without jumping full bore into the theoretical stuff, when we do that later on, we've then also done the historical groundwork that gets us into be able to talk about this as a cultural technique.
Okay, yeah.
That's not what Kang is doing, but Kang's work could easily get incorporated into someone interested in this as a cultural technique.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, has been pointed out, although our audience probably is primarily other rhetoricians in online work. I mean, some of the folks we've been talking to. There's maybe a broader audience of some of the other folks we've been talking to, ranging from media studies folk to to historians of tech or whatever. So yeah, I mean, in terms, our time here is starting to expand.
Oh yeah.
But I mean, in terms of sort of next steps, I mean, that might be something to think about. Let me just show you something really quickly here. Another thing I've been doing is, in addition to these FCM diagrams, you can see this, right? I shared the right thing.
Yeah, and have these been shared?
No.
Okay.
I can. It's just I literally made these last night. So.
Oh yeah, no. I would just wanted to make just at least not even online, but at least in the Google folder so that I can.
Yeah. And then right now so these are similar but not identical. These are bigram charts. So what these do, and you can see how these have arrows. So these take a slice of the most prevalent bigrams. I haven't done the trigram one yet. And you can see sort of how the things connect, right? So the arrow actually shows direction. Let's take an easy one like public companies. You can see the order there.
Oh, I see. That's what I was guessing the arrow did.
Well, see, and some things can be bidirectional. Let's see if we find one here. Okay, here's one up here, questions. So answer questions, but then also, so these are both actually pointing to questions. I'm trying to find one that has arrows going in and out. Well, you get the gist of it. Yeah. So these are, probably survey does. Well, so these essentially map bigrams. So it's in a way kind of similar to the FCM, because if the FCM, you're like, well, these are words that co-occur in the document. These are bigrams. So again, they do co-occur in documents, but they are phrases, In a way, you can think of engrams as like specialized versions of what's in the FCM, because the FCM is just co-occurrence within a document. These are paired. and then 3-word phrases, right? And they do show you this kind of interesting stuff, which you don't get in the FCM of like look at survey or ISN, right? Where you can see the things that are attached to it and that it attaches to. And they do show some things like this doesn't pop up in the FCM, but I think is useful. Reliving past events. And again, these are just bigrams. So it's actually reliving past and past events.
Right.
But those are obviously all coming together. And when I do the trigrams, I'm sure we'll see that. But like this to me, when I saw this, I was like, holy cow, that's such a human thing. All of these words, reliving. You don't tell a machine to relive something.
Yeah, you just tell it to run it again or something.
The notions of just, our connotations of these language, reliving, past. Yeah. Event maybe is a little fuzzier, but past. Do machines have pasts the way humans have pasts? This suggests no. I mean, again, we want to look at the language. The language suggests past is a different concept for a human and a machine, right?
Yeah.
Living is probably just the human concept. Past is shared, but differently.
Yeah.
So these are going to be a little bit trickier because when I do the weighted bigrams and trigrams, you might remember my work computer was struggling.
That's right.
I'm bumping against that again because, once we bump up the weighted corpus, it gets into the trillions. I think. I mean, the numbers were getting into like notations that I couldn't read immediately. But it starts to press the limits of the resources of my machine. So I have a strategy for this, but it's going to take a little bit longer to do these. Anywho, so in terms of next steps, what we're looking at is I'm going to be writing this stuff up. So right now we're right here where I'm doing the FCM diagrams and the n-gram network diagrams. And they are indeed unstemmed with no numbers. Then transitioning to how do you group these things together? Mm-hmm. And so we look at topic models and clusters, which we've already done. We've got this stuff. We just haven't written it up. But the LDA, Viz, that stuff exists. The clusters, those already exist. So I don't have to run those. They're already there. So that's the stage I'm at. Then we'll move on to compensation tiers, relying mostly on keyness, but then also these other things. This, I won't be running these because, as I mentioned, we've got the keyness diagrams. Running these, we get another 30 diagrams. I don't think there's value in doing it.
Okay.
There's going to be more stuff. Then the word level stuff. So I'm going to be writing up this stuff. I imagine it's going to take me probably, I would say, the rest of the month.
Okay.
All this is highly contingent on how much time I get to do this. It'd be, I was counting on this being a summer where I'd be working rather than doing 24-hour-a-day childcare.
Yeah.
Well, not 24 hours. She sleeps at some point.
Blessedly.
So, it really kind of comes down to that. But so in terms of next step, this is what I'm going to be doing. What would be helpful is if you, as you pointed out, other results that can be folded in here. So the one we talked about previously had to do with like the autofill stuff.
Yeah.
Where would that fit in this structure? And I'm not putting you on the spot, but let me know either. I guess just let me know. We do have this document of this one. It's the preliminary findings document.
Yeah.
Which has the things we've discussed, and it breaks it down into this is the overall. Really, it's not just frequency. This is categorization tiers, and this is word level stuff.
Okay.
So it follows the breakdown in the outline. But so if you have other things to fold in here, just let me know, and we will. And then also, moving forward, if you start thinking about
Yeah.
the discussion, I mean, the discussion and the intro are linked entities because what we find in the discussion, how frameworks help us understand our findings, how they tap into a larger theoretical context, how they let us know what this means. Once we have this in the discussion, it's going to be set up in the intro.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you can do those two things, identify results that should be folded in and start thinking about these larger sort of theoretical issues of how do we interpret
Yeah.
our findings.
Well, that'll be good too, because I never, I think I put some stuff in it, but some of that history primer stuff, I might go back into that, and because I've got stuff I wrote up for that. I just never, because I still foolishly handwrite everything first, which means I have to add the step of then retyping everything again. But
are you talking about, oh, right, the history primer, which I don't know, did we ever share this?
I think we did. It's up on the.
It's in the Google thing. I don't think we shared it on the Manifold site.
Oh, maybe not.
Because right now it's quotations.
Yeah, it's just I was just chunking. I was at the chunking stage.
Yeah, the thing on the Manifold site is this articulation of theory.
Okay, that's right. I saw the primer thing in the Google Doc. Yeah, that's where I saw it.
Which, and this is on Manifold. It's more kind of, just thinking our way through object-oriented and ANT and cultural techniques. And yeah, I don't think the history primer it's there in the Google
It's
folder.
not up yet. Yeah, no, and this is why, because I put in my quotes first, and then I've got to add in my.
It looks like some of it is.
And I'll go back in, and I'm going to go back into when I was looking at some of these these weighted and unweighted unigrams, bigrams, and trigrams. There were a couple things that jumped out at me, so I will flag those for you.
Okay.
But I think a lot of them ended up, I think we had a couple of meetings ago, I think a lot of the ones that are on that list, I think made it there. So
I tried to.
Yeah.
Because while we were having our discussions during the episodes, I was trying to, update these things.
But yeah.
So, I mean, go through the outline. As I mentioned, I'm using the outline like an outline. It's not like, typical, you write the paper, then you write the outline afterward because your teacher told you to. I mean, I use these bloody outlines because it's difficult to get your arms around it. The preliminary findings document, I use that. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so that's the gist of things. Oh man, you got anything else?
No, that's it for me. But now this has been helpful in terms of figuring out I just need to, now the outline is clicking for me. So.
And I don't think we need to get overwhelmed with the size of it, because right now, I mean, I'm writing up results, right? And largely you're going to be thinking about connecting those results with larger theoretical import, right? If we can just focus on those, we don't have to deal with the paper as a whole. We just need to deal with.
No.
I mean, the strength of the MRAD is it's like they're semi-discrete sections. So it's like, I don't have to write the paper. I just have to write this section,
Yeah. And that is I have to learn that lesson every time I write something.
Well, I mean, it's a larger discussion, but our field also, is weird about methods in that frequently they're not acknowledged.
Yeah.
There's just sort of a default. I'm going to read some stuff, then I'm going to say some stuff, right?
Yeah.
Anywho, it's more than I want to get into now.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I've got my marching orders.
Yeah, me too. All right, then. I guess that's it.
All right. See you next time.
See ya.